Hello class. We're going to start talking about fossil records next in our section of science and how they can help us determine how populations change over time. So fossils are pretty cool, and it kind of gives us a nice little geological time print of Earth. So we're going to start by fossil basics. So always good to start with some definitions. What is a fossil? A fossil is preserved remains of dead organisms from millions of years ago. So we have it is also a snapshot of the past. So it can tell us kind of what organisms lived there and at what time. We have a cool little picture of a skeleton left of a old organism, which was around a long time ago. So it's really cool to be able to look at the Earth around the fossil and then be able to date how long ago it was around. But what can become a fossil? Usually bones, shells, or other hard body parts. So a lot of skeletons are what we have remains of. Also, we can see shells. They're actually quite easy to find, different fossilized shells from a long time ago. But how do these hard body parts become a fossil? The hard parts turn into minerals, which become a part of the rock they are in. So if you look at this little guy, you can see each one of his bones, but it doesn't look like a bone of a recent animal that's nice and white. It is dark, and that's because it has turned into a mineral, and then it is almost a part of this rock. It would take a lot of time and effort, and you might even damage the fossil if you tried to get all of the rock from around it out just to have the skeleton. Important question is, can other things be preserved? So we have different things like fur and maybe even eyes and different parts that can be preserved in areas. Ooh, I gotta quit moving my mouse. In other parts, such as fur, can be preserved if animals are in areas that don't have oxygen, water, or bacteria, like tar pits or ice. So our decomposers are what they called, are little bugs that eat everything that is just kind of rotting away, live in places that have oxygen and water. So if we remove the oxygen and water and remove the bacteria, then we can have things like fur or other soft tissue, like muscles even, be preserved. They also have found recent things in Antarctica or even in the Arctic of woolly mammoths that have been frozen since the Ice Age. So that's really cool. But for the most part, it's pretty rare to even have a fossil, and it's even rarer to have something that is soft preserved. So it is really cool when we can find some. But the real question is, how can we use this as evidence for evolution? So we have to remember our definition of evolution, which we talked about in, I think, our very first video. So evolution is a process that results in changes in the genetic material of a population over time. So we've kind of broken that down before, but the important part is it's the genetic material that is changing. It's a population, not just an individual, and it's over time. So fossils surrounded by older rock have organisms that are older, which would make sense. So this is a great picture that we have over here on the right. We can see that the top layer would be the newest dirt, the newest rock that we can find, I should say, not dirt, rock. And as we go farther back, this rock is lower. So we can look and maybe find a fossil of this thing that looks almost like a T-Rex, a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and look that it comes back farther and trace it back to a fossil. Maybe if we found a fossil right here that looked very similar to a bird and to a Tyrannosaurus Rex, we could maybe have some evidence that these two animals were once were evolved from the same common ancestor. And we can keep doing that as we go farther back and things start to look more and more similar. So at one point, maybe our Stegosaurus looking animal looked a lot like a bird. So that would have to be farther back. It wouldn't look much like they do today, like we know, but as we know them, but as we go farther back, they look more and more similar until we have one common ancestor. So this aging can allow us to classify the animals by age and by common bone structure. So we can classify all the animals, all the skeletons we find of all those fossils with all the birds that look the same. So we can say, oh, this might have been a population of birds, or maybe these are two separate species of birds, but they were around at the same time just because their bone structures look the same. And maybe even because the rocks that we found them in were about the same age. So another important thing as we are trying to find some evidence for evolution is that fossil structure tells us about function. So important thing to remember is structure determines function. We have these things called homologous structures. So the root homo means same. And so the same looking structures. The definition for homologous structures are similar structures which evolved from a common ancestor. So animals with similar structure. So then our evidence or our theory would be animals with a similar, theory, not evidence, but animals with a similar structure have a common ancestor. So we can look at our picture and we can look at an arm of a human, of a cat, of whales, and of a bat, and notice a very similar structure. So we have a arm bone, which is the humerus, going into a radius and an ulna bone, and then we have a group of small bones, which becomes the wrist, and then fingers. For our cat and humans look very similar, but even when you look at the whale, you can still see the whale and the bat, you can still see a humerus, you can still see radius and ulna, you can still see wrist bones. They look a little bit different, but it's the same structure. Whales with their big, long flippers, I don't know the technical term, I guess, have developed longer fingers than maybe us humans, and and a bat with a large wing definitely has longer fingers than us and smaller wrists, but they all look the same and have a similar structure. So we also have another thing called vestigial structures, which help give us evidence that evolution occurred. These are really cool structures. It's a vestigial structure, sorry, that's a hard word for me to say, is a structure which has lost all or most of its original function. So over time, or what can this tell us about evolution? That these bones were once useful in a organism but have become useless because as the animal evolved, these structures shrunk because they were no longer needed. Some of my favorite examples are whales. This is a whale skeleton, kind of shrunk. It would be much larger in real life. Actually has legs. It has a pelvis bone and then a small little, two small little legs. When we look at a whale, we don't see that from the outside, but they're in there. Also, another thing is when we look at humans, this is a human spine. We don't see from the outside a tail, but we have a tailbone. This circle right here is our tailbone. So that is evidence that at one point whales had legs and we had a tail. But since we have not found a use for those structures, they have shrunk and become almost useless. Some other fun examples are humans have wisdom teeth. Our teeth that are very far back ones are our wisdom teeth. Those were once useful when maybe we were eating had a very different diet, maybe more grains maybe more leaves, or even maybe it was a more meat diet to kind of chew that meat. We also have an appendix, which is in your stomach area. Some other fun ones are wings on flightless birds. I think of an emu. An emu is a big, tall bird with really long legs that runs really fast, but the wings on it are very small because it can't fly, and it hasn't been able to fly for a long time. So that would be a vestigial structure. Pelvis bones on snakes. Snakes don't have legs, they just have their little spine, but they have a pelvis which would allow them to grow legs. Pelvis is what our hip is. It's where our legs come from. So I think that is also an interesting one. There are some fish that live in the deep, deep ocean that are, it is completely dark. There is no light down there, so they are actually blind, yet they still have eyes. So they can't see anything out of their eyes, but they're still there. So that's another interesting structure. So we can see these vestigial structures and homologous structures in fossils too, and in these dinosaurs that we look at. So we can see that T-Rex have small arms, making their arms a vestigial structure. We can also see that our T-Rex bodies look similar to birds with large legs and tails, meaning they have homologous structures. And so we can also find evidence that from fossils of a common ancestor between a bird and a T-Rex. So I like to use some of our more modern animals, such as whales and humans, because I think it's easier to picture, but we can also use this same reasoning to determine that fossils, determine evolution, prove that fossils can be evidence for evolution. Thank you.